What a great honor, truly a great honor to be graced by the presence of a legend who is alive and without whom I, simply speaking, cannot imagine the philosophical and political world. Thanks to his beautiful mind, we continue to be educated, transformed, critiqued, led, and much, much, much more. I cannot emphasize enough how honored I feel to have this great professor in my African Ascent International program, mind you, for the third time. Look at the generosity, look at the kindness for him to give me 3 precious times of his incredibly busy schedule. Today's program, I hope, would be one of the best, with the transcendence blessing, to examine in great detail what I've called the architecture of the human mind. As everybody knows, and perhaps you don't, the great Kemetian priests, Kemet, Egypt, that is, about 2,500 years ago, shared with us an incredible hypothesis in which they wondered about the origin of the cosmos, that is, the origin of the universe, and advanced the hypothesis that to them, the universe originated out of what they called noon, which could be metaphorically captured as something that is dynamic, as something that is infinite, as something that is ever-flowing. Of course, they likened it with the human water, but it's not exactly water. Noon is a quasi-matter of some kind, out of which the Egyptian philosophical imagination thought what we call the world embodied in our universe, one of the universes, because there are millions of them out there. What they did not do after they shared this insight with us is to take the next leap and tell us exactly what matter is. They didn't. Perhaps, as Professor Noam Chomsky would say, this is a credit to their humility. Perhaps they did not know what the properties of matter are. They only knew that the universe originated out of something which is quasi-materialist, that they called noon. This hypothesis survives well into the 20th century, and our century, which declared the century to be the century of the brain, has been attempting, Professor Noam Chomsky would argue, not successfully, to unveil the properties of this matter. My first question then, with which I would like to begin, is to learn from Professor Noam Chomsky as he dissects the achievements, the challenge, and the formulatable questions, as he calls them, because to him, there are questions that must be formulated such that we can generate answers to them, and then there are questions that simply cannot be formulated, therefore cannot be asked. And because they cannot be asked, they cannot be answered. I have dubbed this method methodic questioning. Descartes had methodic doubt. Zara Yaqub, the Ethiopian philosopher, had methodic belief, as they called it. And now I would like to say Professor Noam Chomsky has his methodic questioning. So my first question to the professor is then to take us back to the 17th century, and for the sake of my curious readers, to summarize the arguments for us. What the questions were, what was answered, what the relationship between matter and mind was, as he deciphers the contributions of Descartes, the famous dualist, Newton after him, Galileo, Hume. It's a long list of great thinkers whose works Professor Noam Chomsky, in numerous writings, has summarized brilliantly. Let's begin there, Professor.
Well, the 17th century scientific revolution, which changed the world changed our understanding of the world enormously, began with skepticism and often ridicule of the neo-scholastic doctrines that were reigning at the time, neo-Aristotelian, neo-scholastic doctrines, which seemed to offer an answer to everything, but an answer which collapsed into vacuity as soon as it was looked at carefully. So, for example, if I have a cup of tea in my hand, I hold my hand over it, I let go, the cup falls to the ground, the steam goes to the sky. Why? Well, they're going to their natural place. The natural place for the cup is the earth. It's made out of something solid. The natural place for the steam is the sky, so they go there. Well, if I look at you, I see a person. Why do I see a person? Well, the form of your face goes through the air and it enters into my mind, and there's a form of your face there. These were not regarded as satisfactory answers. Galileo, his contemporaries, wanted to eliminate what they called the occult ideas of the neo-scholastics, such as those I was talking about. If two masses attract one another, that's because they have sympathy. If they repel one another, it's because they have antipathy. It wasn't considered a satisfactory answer. So they constructed, Galileo and others developed what was called the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy at the time just meant what we call science. So they developed the mechanical science, which argued that the world is constructed much the way complex artifacts are constructed. You may recall that at this period in Europe, there was a proliferation of very complex artifacts put together by skilled artisans, which even seemed to duplicate things that were humans were doing. Complex clocks, fountains at Versailles, figures in dramas that were acting like humans and so on. So the idea is, well, the world is just a more complex version of this produced by the supreme architect, divinity, made a perfect world out of gears and levers and things pushing and pulling each other and so on. That's mechanical science, mechanical philosophy, as it was called. It was accepted by just about all scientists through the 17th century. The Descartes, Isaac Newton, Leibniz, all of the great scientists, the Royal Academy in England, Robert Boyle, and so on, different variants of it. Well, Descartes actually, his main work from his point of view, not what we study today, was to work out the details of this mechanical science, published several volumes of work on this. He tried to show that all of the phenomena of the inorganic world, the organic world, most of humans, what humans do, perception, sensation, all of this, he argued, could be explained within the mechanical philosophy. He gave many details. He also argued that some things fall outside it. One of them is what we now call mind. He called soul. The ability, one of the main examples that he used in the discourse was the fact that what you and I are now doing right now, the fact that humans, unlike anything in the or other elsewhere in the organic or inorganic world, humans are capable of producing an infinite array of thoughts in their mind and using these thoughts appropriately in circumstances. So right now, when you ask that question, I'm not reading off the latest baseball scores. I'm answering in a way which is supposed to be appropriate to the discourse that you set up. We do this all the time in our ordinary life. You go into a store to buy something, you don't talk randomly. You produce expressions which may be novel for you, maybe in the history of the language, but are appropriate to the situation, though Descartes argued not caused, appropriate but not caused. This creative aspect of language use he regarded as outside the framework of the mechanical philosophy, some other things as well. He was elaborating views that had been expressed already by Galileo in particular, who in his discourse on two world systems, one of the protagonists, Grotto, discusses the fact that expresses his awe and amazement at the what he regards as the astonishing capacity of humans to construct from a finite number of symbols an infinite array of thoughts in their minds, and to go beyond this, even to find ways to communicate to others what's happening in their minds, even to others who have no direct access to their minds. They regarded this as an astonishing accomplishment. That's basically Descartes' departure from mechanical philosophy. In fact, Galileo regarded the alphabet as the most spectacular of human inventions because it was able to record this amazing achievement. Well, that takes us to the peak of the mechanical philosophy. Isaac Newton's great contribution was to demonstrate that Descartes' arguments just didn't work at all, even for the most elementary things, like the terrestrial the movement of the heavenly bodies, falling objects, nothing worked. Christian Huygens, another great scientist of the time, also demonstrated that these arguments just totally collapsed. So there was no basis for the mechanical philosophy. That meant that the mechanical philosophy did have a concept of what matter is: bodies, material, physical matter. It was these complex artifacts which included the whole universe. Well, it all collapsed with these refutations. Where the modern philosophy sometimes talks, Gilbert Ryle, about how we've succeeded in getting rid of what they call the ghost in the machine, the mind. It was actually the opposite. Newton got rid of the machine, left the ghost intact, had nothing to say about it. And we are left with no concept of what matter is. John Locke understood this very quickly. Shortly after Newton's Principia appeared, Locke commented in an article that he put it in his own theological framework. I'll repeat it in that framework, but we can revise it in secular terms. As Locke put it, just as God, he said, as the incomparable Mr. Newton has shown us, God has added to matter properties of which we cannot conceive, like attraction, repulsion, motion, and so on. And so God might have superadded to matter the property of thought, which is just another part of organized matter. Matter here means whatever the world is constituted of. Obviously, we don't know. Well, rephrasing that without the theological framework, just as the whatever constitutes the world has properties of which we have no conception, but we have to accept that they're there. I mean, as Newton showed, the later developments elaborated, the properties are there, we don't know what it's about. And similarly, some organized part of whatever the world is constituted of will have the property of thought. That's sometimes called the thesis of thinking matter. That was developed through the 18th century quite extensively, led most extensively in the work of chemist, philosopher Joseph Priestley, the end of the 18th century. What we call mind is just some properties of organized matter, whatever matter turns out to be. Well, these ideas were pretty much forgotten in the 19th century. They disappeared under the behaviorist and structuralist conceptions of the early 20th century. They were finally rediscovered in the decade of the brain, to which you referred to. The last decade of the 20th century was declared to be the decade of the brain, and a lot of efforts and research and discussion went into elaborating what we know about the brain, which turns out is not very much. But one of the main conclusion, there was a publication that came out of it was published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The introduction was by a leading neuroscientist who was very enthusiastic about what he called the thesis of the new biology. The thesis of the new biology is that what we call mind is just the result of certain properties of organized matter, which we have not yet discovered. Basically, quoting Joseph Priestley from 2 centuries earlier, rediscovering what was taken for granted in the 18th century in the wake of Newton's demolition of the mechanical philosophy. It's about where we stand now. It's, yes, thinking is some property of organized matter, really thinking in a very broad sense. That means all that we do with our mental capacities. Some property of organized matter, which we do not know how to relate to the other properties of organized matter that yield attraction, repulsion, motion, and so on. There's generally adopted thesis in the neurosciences that it's that thinking is a property of neural networks and their interconnections. That's very questionable. One leading cognitive neuroscientist, Randy Gallistel, has argued, I think, pretty persuasively that the systems that are being investigated, neural nets, simply do not have the properties of, he puts it in terms of the modern theory of computation from Turing and others. They do not have the properties of computational devices which enable us to carry out this activity that amazed Galileo and Descartes, creating infinitely many new thoughts, even transmitting them to others. They don't have that capacity. He's right about that. They don't. So this is now in modern terms. None of this is put in historical terms, but we can if we like. And what he's arguing is that we have to look for elements that have vastly greater computational capacity than neural networks, maybe down to the cellular level. Physicist, Nobel Prize laureate Roger Penrose has made similar arguments. Basically, we simply don't know. So we don't know what matter is. As Newton put it, we know so little about matter that for all we know, it could be that all matter is alive. When you get to the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Arthur Eddington, famous astrophysicist, added that we know so little about matter that we cannot say that all matter is not conscious. Not because of lack of understanding of consciousness, but because we don't know anything about what matter is. It's just whatever there is. Whatever there is has these properties, and that's the best we can do. After Newton took some time, but science basically turned into a new direction. The science from early modern science, Galileo, Boyle, Huygens, Leibniz, Descartes, Newton, all believed that accepted they were looking for a conception of matter that would be intelligible to us. Their goal was intelligibility. And Newton himself regarded his own discoveries as he put it, so absurd that no person with any scientific knowledge could accept them. But nevertheless, he said, well, they just happen to be true. They're absurd, but what can we do? They're true. So we have to content ourselves with what he called a mathematical theory. His own work was not physical theory, which would have answered the question. It was mathematical theory. It was in that context that Newton made his famous statement that I make no hypotheses. He says, I can't speculate about what the reality is. I can only tell you these are some of its properties. Well, that became modern science. Modern science began to search for the best explanatory theories that we can find to account for the properties of what we observe. We give up the hope for an intelligible universe. That's not even a consideration anymore. Let's just find the best theories we can of what works. It's a big turn in the development of modern science, which basically leads us up till today. Fair amount is known about the brain, but essentially nothing that deals with these questions.
And now, thank you for that remarkable response, which is really a summary of a classical article that he published in 2014, which is one of my living Bibles. Brilliantly written, nicely summarized, informative. I suggest all my readers to look for this particular piece and read it very carefully at the history of mechanistic philosophy, which, unless I'm wrong, has now become replaced by neuroscience, really, because both John Searle and Dennett continue to insist that mental states are nothing more than brain states, and in that if we understood the brain comprehensively, then we could have naturally understood the nature of the mind, which is a thesis that you've been challenging, and to my great satisfaction, you happen to be right. Now, let me ask you some questions and hope that I can formulate them such that they could be answered, namely this. Two questions, really. What is it like to be Professor Noam Chomsky?
It's to be somebody who very much agrees with Galileo's astonishment and amazement at this incredible capacity that we have to do what you and I are doing right now. It's a species characteristic of human beings. It's common to all humans. We all apparently have essentially the same capacities. Apart from extreme pathology, really extreme, all humans seem to be the same. Blind, deaf, blind, those with very little stimulus from the outside all develop the same capacities. On the other hand, no other organism can even begin to do it. So I have, can't use the word, or there'll be a race to the door, but I have two creatures sitting quietly under my desk, and you can give them all of the evidence that every infant has. They'll only hear noise, nothing. Maybe pick out a few sounds that tell them you can get this or that thing that you want. But, and the same is true of an intelligent chimpanzee, almost identical with us genetically, not entirely, but to them it's just noise. To an infant, newborn infant, it's language immediately. And it then goes through a regular process of maturation and development, quickly becomes what you and I are now doing. Experimental work by now has shown that down to the level of 2 to 3 years old, children, though they don't exhibit it in behavior, have very deep knowledge of the nature of language and thought. All of this was amazing. I mean, Galileo didn't know all of this, but he knew the basic points, and he was right to be amazed and astonished by it. Descartes was right to think that we need some new principle to account for it. We still don't know that principle. John Locke was right to think that whatever organized matter, whatever matter is, whatever the world consists of, we don't know, but we'll call it matter. Whatever matter is, some organization of it yields the properties of thought that you and I are now engaged in, and same with every other human being on earth, but no one else. I think we should continue to be just as amazed as Galileo was by this. It is an amazing fact. We know very little about it. You repeat what Dan Dennett and others say about if we knew the structure of the brain, we'd understand it all. That's repeating what John Locke said hundreds of years ago. Yes, if we knew what matter is, which we don't, and certain organized properties of matter, which we don't know, then we'd know what thought is. Yes, that's true, but empty. And just repeating what was said centuries ago as if it's a great new discovery is not very exciting.
Mm-hmm. And now, Professor Noam Chomsky, one of your favorite questions, to which I know you respond in great detail to the benefit of my audience. Can machines think?
Well, that question was asked in a classic paper by Alan Turing, one of the great mathematicians who created the modern theory of computation. He wrote a paper in 1950 with a title, something like that, Can Machines Think? It's the foundation of what we now call artificial intelligence. Turing's own answer to this question was, I'll quote, "The question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion." That was his answer to the question, can machines think? The reason was that we just don't know what thinking is. We do know what machines are, but we should not be misled about this. Turing certainly wasn't. He understood perfectly well. By a machine, he didn't mean something like the characters in Star Wars, R2-D2, cute little robots. That's not what he meant by machine. A machine is software. A machine is a program. That's what he meant by machine. That's what scientists who know what they're talking about mean by machines. They mean programs. The computer that is in front of me it can implement these programs. Apart from its ability to implement these programs, it could just as well be a paperweight. It's nothing. It doesn't think, doesn't do anything. It implements programs. It's the programs that are achieving whatever is done in artificial intelligence. Turing himself thought that since the question is too meaningless to deserve discussion, let's change it to a different question. And the question that he posed was what's now sometimes called the Turing test. He called it the imitation game. Let's see if it's possible to construct a program which will be similar enough to humans so that an observer will not be able to tell the difference between the output of this program and what a human does. That's the imitation game. Turing didn't know it, of course, but he was repeating something that had been proposed in the 17th century when Descartes proposed that we need a new principle to account for thinking, res cogitans, thinking substance. His associates, especially Jacques de Cordemois, minor Descartesian, suggested that we develop tests. He said, if there's some creature that looks like us, and we want to know if that creature has the capacity for thought, let's run through a series of tests and see if that creature answers appropriately to the kinds of questions that we can put to it without limit. That's the Turing test. For de Cordemois and Descartes, this was a serious question, very serious question. Remember, this is the 17th century. The question whether some other creature has a soul is not a small point. If it has a soul, we have to Christianize it, save its soul, and so on. If it doesn't have a soul, it's just an object of some kind. That goes right into the brutal and vicious history of colonialism, which was developing at the same time. These are intimately interrelated. So they were finding all kind of strange creatures that didn't look like the white men that they were used to. People with dark skins, apes. And the big question was, which of them are human? Which have souls? The ones who have souls, we have to Christianize and enslave. The ones who don't have souls, they can run around in the forest. So these were not trivial questions. And in terms of their human consequences, they were horrendous. I mean, it led to the slaughter of tens of millions of people in the Western Hemisphere, enslavement of Africans, all kind of hideous consequences. So these are not for the 17th century, these were very far-reaching questions. But at the heart of it, the Courtois proposals were basically the Turing test. So Turing proposed it, of course, knowing nothing about any of this, and argued that the reason for it would be it might be an incentive to improve programming, improve machines. And he thought it might, he said, in 50 years, it might lead to a different way in which we might think about thinking. Maybe we'll think about thinking as answering questions. Well, but the question itself, can machines think, is too meaningless to deserve discussion, as he pointed out. And we should think this through, and we're now being deluged with propaganda about exciting systems like ChatGPT and so on, which produce discourse that looks sort of like what humans do. And a lot of excitement about that in the media, a lot of confusion about it in scientific circles. Should think it through. These systems, if you look at them, take them apart, they're basically high-tech plagiarism. That's what they are. So ChatGPT, and it's the others like it, what they do is scan astronomical amounts of data, and they find regularities in the superficial aspects of the data. And when you spring together things with regularities, you get something that looks a little bit like what the original might have been. It's basically no more interesting than plagiarism is, except you can do it very fast and with huge amounts of data, and you get much more realistic looking things, but essentially tells you nothing. It certainly tells you nothing about language or thought, because these very same systems will work on impossible languages and do just as well. So they essentially tell you nothing. It's a game. It doesn't have any useful purpose that I can see, but except maybe PR for Silicon Valley. But it's not that the systems that are used do have useful consequences. So like, I happen to be hard of hearing. So right now I'm reading live transcription because I can't hear what you're saying. Well, that's produced by the same systems, and that's useful. There's nothing wrong with technology that serves useful purposes, but we should not be bemused by it and misled by it. It's basically brute force technology, clever programming, a lot of intricate statistical analysis, serious work, has useful results, but it's not telling us anything about thinking or mind or anything else. To go back to the fact that when we're talking about machines, Turing and the rest of us, we're talking about programs. Well, what's a program? A program is simply a theory of a pretty strange sort. It's a theory which has to answer every question. The computer can't implement a program unless every question is answered, including the questions for which we have no answers. Scientific theories aren't like that. They're tentative, open. A serious theory doesn't say, I answer this question because I want to. You leave it open if you don't know the answer. But a program doesn't have that latitude. Everything has to be answered, even if we have no idea what we're talking about. So it's a special kind of program of a unique type, a theory of a unique type with every question answered. And it has to be written in the notation that the object in front of me can implement. Well, so suppose we ask, there are now conferences taking place of lots of big names on whether a machine can be conscious. What does that mean? Well, what it means is, do we have a theory of consciousness? That's what it means. Answer, no, we don't. That's the end of the conference. Okay, we don't have a theory of consciousness, so what's the point of talking about it? Develop a theory if you want to. But the amount of confusion about this is enormous, and the basic points are really quite simple. A machine means a program. A program is a theory. Theory, as I say, of a special kind, not the kind that scientists construct, because it answers questions. It selects a random answer when there's no answer. So it's that kind of theory. So to ask whether a machine can be conscious is to say, do we have a theory of consciousness? Interesting question, very simple answer. No, we don't. But there's no further point beyond that. Turing's comment is correct. Questions are too meaningless to deserve discussion.
Incredible. As you know, as you have convincingly argued in that classic paper, the great Newton, whom Hume described as a rare genius and humble at the same time, to whom it never occurred to ask the question, why is there motion? Because he knows that it can't be answered, but he did try to describe how things move. Similarly, one could also ask the same kind of question about the architecture of the mind, I think. Newton did not think, so I learned from you, and you have convinced me, that we can unveil the mysteries of matter. We simply have to live with the fact that we are not capacitated intellectually to fully and completely understand what matter is, but we can describe things within matter by theoretical principles, through the use of which we will answer some of our puzzles. Could we also say something similar about the architecture of the mind? Is it possible to unveil the mysteries of the mind, Professor?
You'll remember how David Hume completed that observation. In his History of England, he had a chapter on Newton, who he regarded as the most sublime intellect that had ever arisen in the human race. And he said that Newton succeeded in lifting the veil from many of the mysteries of the universe, but he left others which never will be understood. Those are the way we could put that, at least the way I would put it, is that the human mind is an organic object, whatever it is. It's part of the universe. It's not out of the universe. Like other capacities, it has a certain scope and certain limits. Scope and limits are in fact related logically. The reason we can have the scope that so amazed Galileo is because there's an internal structure which yields those properties. But that same internal structure prevents other things from happening, just as there are possible languages and simple systems of thought, there are impossible ones. Those two things go together. Impossible for humans, maybe some other kind of intelligence, but not for humans. That was Hume's conclusion. We just live with the fact that there are things we can understand, there are things we can't. And Newton made it reasonably clear what the division is. We can develop mathematical theories, precise theories of certain aspects of the way the world is constituted, and that's as far as we can go. The way Bertrand Russell put it was science is a study of the causal structure of the world, but nothing more. That leaves open many, many questions, which we can grasp in some fashion, but we can't develop scientific theories of. A lot of people, a lot of scientists reject this, believe we can answer every question, but I don't see any reason to believe that. So what can we do? We can forge ahead, trying to construct the best explanatory theories we can of certain aspects of the world, including aspects of what we call our mental life. So my own particular prime interest happens to be language, and we can, in fact, make a fair amount of progress in discovering the crucial properties of the shared human language, the shared capacity for human language, which is core human property and is the basis for much of what we loosely call thought. The kinds of thought that are articulated in language are the kinds that we can use for reflecting, evaluating, judging, planning, so on. That component of our mental life is captured in language. We use it all the time unconsciously, and we can learn a fair amount about that. But there are limits. We don't understand. There are lots of things about it we just don't understand. And one of the things we don't understand is very simple. What are you and I doing now? How are we able to produce, not just produce the expression of a thought, but one that is appropriate to the circumstances, but not caused by the circumstances? So in my current situation right now, I could start talking about the weather outside, or about, a million other topics you can think of. I'm not going to do it because it's not appropriate. But what is that notion of appropriate but uncaused? We don't know. And it's something that's so simple that we use it all the time. It's what we're engaged in constantly. We have no idea what's involved in it. None, not even bad ideas.
Let me then end the interview. We have about 10 minutes left with a fun question. And please respond to it as long as you want. What is it like to see a sunset?
The fact of the matter is, that's one of the interrogative expressions, which is not a legitimate question because it has no possible answer. When you ask the question, what is it like to see a sunset? There's nothing to say. If you had asked a slightly different question, what was it like to see the sunset last night? I could answer that in great detail. Could tell you exactly what it was like to see the sunset last night, the colors, the clouds, the disappearance of the sun over the hills. I give you a very detailed answer. That's a legitimate question. What is it like to see that sunset? Is a legitimate question to which we have detailed answers. We have no theoretical explanation for it, but we can give detailed answers. But if we ask, what is it like to see a sunset? What can you say? It's nice. It's pleasant. You can't say anything. So it's not a legitimate question. So therefore, it's never going to have an answer. And many of the questions that are asked about consciousness are not going to have answers because they're not legitimate questions. Like Thomas Nagel's question, what is it like to be a bat? Can't answer that. You can't answer the question, what's it like to be a human? What's it like to be me? I can't answer the question, what's it like to be me? I could answer the question, what's it like to be me at this moment? Well, I could describe what it's like to be me now. But if you ask, what's it like to be me? I have no way to answer it. So you can formulate interrogative expressions which have no answers, kind of like, why do things happen? That has the form of a question, but it's never going to have an answer because there's no legitimate question. So things that have the form of questions are going to be answerable only if they have the properties that enable us to answer them. No point formulating interrogative expressions which can't have any answers. We can try to deal with those that we can formulate in a clear and precise enough way so maybe we can have answers. And it may be that some other kind of creature, not us, could find answers to these questions, but we can't. So I think we just have to be thoughtful about the way we formulate questions and not be misled by things that sound profound, but like can machines be conscious, but when you take them apart, don't seem to be saying anything.
Mm-hmm. But Professor Noam Chomsky, I sense that you love your dogs. You know them intimately. You've been observing
Don't say that word.
You've been observing them for years. Would it be appropriate to ask you to imagine what it might be to be a dog? Your dog, in particular. In fact, let me be more precise. What it is like to be your dog.
Most
because
of what it's
you know
like,
your dog well.
most of what it's like is to be sleeping, but sleeping in a way very different from ours. Sleeping at the verge of waking up. It just takes a hint, an action, a slight motion, they're wide awake, fully active. And then they have a range of things that they want to do. I can't say what they are. We'll have to break up because they'll be racing around wanting to do it. But there are certain activities they want. They're very smart. They can detect somehow, I don't know how, even before I know my intention of doing it, they know I'm going to extricate them to have an activity in the out of doors. I'm sorry for the paraphrases, but it's necessary. If I say the word, they immediately pick it up, even if they look as if they're asleep. I don't know what they're hearing, some kind of noise. It's nothing like what we call a word. Maybe some intonation, maybe some motion of my body, whatever it may be. But they do it in very, very, very quickly, very precisely, understand exactly, and they work things out. Like the cleverest achievement of, I have two dogs. One of them is a border collie, another's a Maltese. The border collie's much more intelligent, much more range of thinking. It has worked out a technique to get me to extricate her from the premises when she wants to. If the little dog, the Maltese, is playing with a toy, the big one, the border collie, will take the toy away from her. And the little one will come over to me and start complaining, make her give it back like two children. And I tell the bigger one to give it back, and she happily gives it back and runs to the door, waiting for her reward. Well, that's pretty clever, I think. Works pretty well. What's going on in her mind? I haven't the slightest idea. But
yes. Now, my final question, a serious one. I don't mean to exhaust you, but I need your feedback from you. I tend to think, perhaps foolishly, that what we call thinking is the activity of the human heart. Although we are conditioned to think that the heart, very much like the brain, is a physical organ, such that the brain has been given the attribute of thinking, which I question, where the heart had become reduced into a physical organ that pumps blood. I tend to look at the heart following an Egyptian insight that it is both a transcendental organ that is produces insights, although the experimental work has to be done, and I haven't done that experimental work. I'm merely a speculative philosopher. And then pumping blood. Would I be correct to advance that hypothesis that perhaps we need a new epistemic vibration to understand what it is that the heart does in addition to pumping blood? Your feedback on this question, which means a lot to me, is very welcome. And be as critical as you can.
That's part of the ordinary way that we look at the world too. You say, I know in my heart that what that person said is not true, but I know it in my heart, whatever that means. So our ways of thinking about things are the same. The idea of an organism, an organ having a function, is pretty misleading. I mean, organs do all sorts of things. When we say this is their function, we're imposing our interpretation for one or another purpose on what they're doing. They're doing many things. Like, take the spine. Its function is to help us stand up, but its function also is to produce white blood cells, to store calcium, to protect the nerve. In fact, if you look at its evolutionary history, it evolved from something that was protecting a nerve, which it still does. So a lot of functions. The functions are things we impose on our, on the basis of our interests and concerns. It's not, so what you say about the heart is, I'm sure if we look at all the things it's doing plenty of things. It's, and the whole organism is, when we say we're thinking, it's not just the brain, it's the whole organism. It happens that the computational aspects of thinking are going on in the brain, but much else is happening as well. I mean, when we think, we all use visual images in various ways. Some people rely on them extensively, others less so. Well, the visual images are constructed by parts of our organism, which include the brain, the eye, much else. And the full functioning of the organism is an extremely intricate matter. Even when you just look at something as neural nets, probably the wrong model for thinking, but there's a lot happening there beyond the electrical signaling. There's chemical interchanges, all kinds of things going on. In an organic, even the simplest organism, nematodes, couple hundred neurons, a lot of complicated things are going on, which aren't really understood. So we're very far from comprehending deep questions about the nature of thought, perception, planning, reflection, and so on. Can say something about them, say a lot about certain aspects of them, but there's a huge amount of mystery, much of it possibly beyond our capacity to comprehend.
I am enormously grateful to you. I'm going to miss you. I wish I could interview you every year, but you've given me your graciously your very busy schedule. And as I said, I'm going to miss your beautiful mind, but I will continue attending to the numerous interviews that you give so that we could continue being friends.
Pleasure to be with you.
So much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Now I can do what my dogs want.
Yeah. now that you know what they're thinking.
They're already standing at the door.
Waiting for you. Yes.
Some say it's interesting. They know that this is ending. I don't know how.
It
But
is
they somehow know.
remarkable. I'll remember that. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Let's
Okay.
keep in touch, Professor.